Hello again, and welcome back to RP-0 America. So, you can see the Earth dipping just below the horizon there. I've set up a small burn just to lower our lunar periapsis. I'm sure that has a moon-specific name that I wouldn't be able to memorize, so I'm happy just calling it moon periapsis. So this will lower our closest point of approach over there so that we can land just a bit further past that. Right, so I've got myself aligned with that burn. I just wanted to start the video before the Earth fell below the horizon, as it now has, just for pretty visuals. All right, so 7 more minutes till that burn. It's a pretty short burn. I can potentially just do it with those 2 little hypergolics. I'll try that. It's just a relatively small refinement to our orbit. Shut down that engine and just see how those do. Those are a pretty damn small acceleration. So I think I will use the main engine to actually carry that out. Because I don't want to spend all the fuel for those. Let's see, is it burning mono? Yeah. I don't want to spend all the fuel that remains in those, so I will use this engine as well. So it is probably just spooling up right now, or maybe not. Not sure why it wouldn't be thrusting. It should be. Oh, weird. Okay, maybe I didn't activate it the way I thought I had. Alright, and good enough. Close. Alright, so yeah, just kind of within, I'll just go a little further actually. Just within 30 kilometers of the surface is kind of what I was hoping for. So we'll be nice and close, but I don't think any lunar mountains stick up there. So I'm landing on the kind of one of the dark lava-covered areas of the moon, and therefore pretty flat. As you can see, there's a period of lunar history when it was all molten, and then kind of these cratered areas filled in with lava. Sure, keep science. Sure, why not? And so these areas that are covered in dark lava have fewer craters. Yeah, keep science. Stop bugging me. Because they're kind of a younger area of the surface compared to the older, light-colored areas, which you can see many more craters because it's an older surface. So there are craters there from older times, whereas there probably would have been craters at the bottom of this big crater before it filled in with lava. All right, and then clearly something very large impacted there after things filled in with lava. Oh, geez. All right. So I want to get around to this point, so I'll just fast forward, warp here. So this video should cover our attempt to land. Oh boy, so now that we've gotten so much closer, it's doing the calculations to render the surface in a 3-dimensional fashion. As you can see, that is a legit. Oh, weird. Did I lose my? What happened? Oh, right. I never actually set up a burn. Yeah, I don't know. This is actually something I'll have to figure out. So I will be rewatching this video after I make it. Because it's been a while since I tested out, because the thrust-away ratios, I've landed things on the moon many times, even relatively heavy things like this, but pretty much always the LEM, and so I kind of have a feel for the thrust-away ratio, burn times and such for that. Not so much for this. This is a little more like the Russian planned lander where they used a crasher, or where they were intending to use a crasher stage. So I'm just going to get myself aligned the opposite direction, because that's the direction the engine will be need to be pointed. Oh man, just love going over these cratered surfaces like Mars or the moon, where you can see the how the game has converted the texture and the height map into this actual 3-dimensional rendering of a crater. Just looks beautiful. All right, and again, between videos I crank down my brightness a bit. Alright, so here you can see this very obvious crater, and there you can see it's that tiny crater there is what you're actually seeing being rendered. That's because we're so close to the surface that our horizon is pretty short, so we can't see the larger crater that's further out that way. Like maybe we're seeing the lip of it in some of these little hills on the edge of the horizon. Maybe not. So anyway, this what remains of this fuel will be expended to slow us down on the way down to the surface. It's taking a while to flip around. I'll just use a bit of time warp. So the amount of fuel remaining in this isn't enough to land us, but it is enough to slow us down so that the next actual terminal stage, the engine which will be slowing us to our final landing, there we go, will be able to carry out the task. So it means that all the dry mass of this engine and the tankage here won't have to be also slowed down. So this is kind of clever. I like that. And that's what was so that concept was similarly used in the N1 L3 Russian lunar landing plan. They had a crasher stage as well. All the stages were in Cyrillic, so I don't remember them very well. All right, so here's the number I'm currently going to be paying a lot of attention to. Right now, like, we've passed periapsis, we've passed our lowest point, and now we're heading uphill again, which is what I wanted to do, because that allows us to, that gives us a bit more leeway in having time to decelerate. It's what I find to be pretty handy, because if you start to like slow down to for your final landing while you're heading down, you're kind of piling two processes onto each other. Let's see. Probably can't exactly use that because I'm retrograde. I'm reversed. Oh, and for realism's sake, I should probably have this open. So there were antennas on the lunar module to communicate with the command and service module, which had a big antenna for communicating with the Earth. And Gemini, because it never got this far in history, it never actually got this far away from the Earth, it didn't have its own antenna design capable of communicating with the Earth. But here we go. Here's one that has been created, which, in my opinion, may be good enough to communicate with the Earth. Maybe not. Maybe it would need to be steerable in various things. But I added this antenna just because, visually speaking, I think this would be incomplete without an antenna. Alright, so let's just get retrograde actually. Surface velocity minus and pitch to 0. Okay, so let's stick with that for now. So one downside of Gemini Direct is if you look where the windows on Gemini are, they are looking up, forward, kind of opposite the direction of motion. It's you'd have to have cameras set up, which I currently don't have simulated on here, but you could imagine you could just have armatures that come out and point cameras down so that the crew can kind of have a way of seeing where they're going, some feedback of what they're doing, whereas the LEM was very consciously designed to have windows so that the crew, the two-man crew landing on the moon could actually see what was going on, where they were going, the direct feedback of where they were heading, where they might land, what effect their burns and such were having on their flight. So doing that with Gemini would be a bit more tricky. Maybe they'd put different windows in, or maybe they'd use cameras on arms. There's a number of different options. All right, so we are going to light the engine here and burn that. Here, let's just close that. That was just kind of an estimation of location, not a specifically planned burn. So now I kind of want to pitch the engine down, as you can see. It's because I want this number to, I don't want to be heading down too fast for this engine, for the final engine, the terminal engine stage, to have trouble. That is very important. So these thrust-to-weight ratios, they change. They're relative to our location. So you need to have a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1 on the moon, in this case, would be just enough to counter the acceleration due to gravity of the moon. And so this engine doesn't have a ton of thrust, just a thrust-to-weight ratio of 2 relative to the moon. And so I need to be mindful that I can't kill velocity too quickly. I have to be careful about when I light my engine, how close to the surface I am, how quickly I'm approaching the surface. It's a really tricky business that's definitely worth practicing if you're going to be landing something on a solid surface. Whether it's the moon or Mars or some other body, it definitely worth practicing without people, but with a craft of a similar size to what you plan to use with people. And of course, in this case, it's I'm testing it with the actual craft that I intend to be putting people in a future mission. So I'll have a little more experience then. So even though we're pitched, right now some of the thrust is burning down, we are still starting to head down now. We've kind of taken off enough velocity. As you see, we're no longer in orbit of the moon. Oh wow, are we really? Right. Oh man. D and R, relative, no, that's docking. Docking, geo, landing moon. Yes, I'd like to see that. How do I get that that window to show up? Let's see, editor, no, compact, background, whoa. Okay, so these are various like options for it, but I just want this window to show up. Yeah. I mean, if somebody knows, it'd be nice if you tell me, but obviously I'm recording this before people see a video, so, but these are definitely things I want to see. So new window, so custom new window in flight, so final docking geo. So it says flight, but I'm not actually seeing it, so I don't know why it's saying that it's there. Oh, maybe, can I actually, so this is the landing moon. Oh, there we go. It's actually an option. Awesome. There we go. Answered my own question. All right. So this is showing me important information for landing. Now, some of it's redundant with that other one, but here it's just kind of concentrated in one location. So I want to, before this engine burns out, because we just have about, come on, go away. I've accidentally clicked on one of those. So before, about a minute from now, this engine's going to burn out. And so I don't want to be heading downhill too much by then. It's a tricky balancing of all these different numbers. So time to impact, suicide burn. So suicide burn at actual landing, you want it to be about 0. And so just seeing how it's changing, it gives you important information about your approach to landing. Although these are currently misleading, and that is because they're telling me information. Well, timed impact isn't. Let's say if I shut off the engines right now, I would smash into the surface of the moon at 1 minute and 47 seconds of in-game time. But this one is misleading because it's calculating this. It's a complex calculation I've probably discussed in the past, or I might find time to discuss later. But it's based on the thrust-weight ratio in the actual current engine I'm using. But this isn't my final engine, so that number is inaccurate because it's for my current engine stage and not for the one I'll actually be landing with. So right now I am just trying to slow my fall in the last seconds here. So we get to a relatively high acceleration with that engine. So now I need to switch over. So switch stages, sure, science. And so there we go. There are the little legs that we'll be using. All right, and now let's light that engine. Yes, right. So I can't actually lock, I can't use SAS now. So that's why that popped up. So I need to kind of hand manage this. Actually, technically the way I often would do it would be with surface velocity minus, or, see, that's going to, so okay, let's just let that calibrate, and hopefully I don't. Okay, so suicide burn, I need to counter that. So I need to be pitching like so. There we go. So that number heads towards 0, because right now it's saying that the engine is going to, like, we're going to stop moving 5 seconds after we hit the ground, like we're going to hit a velocity of 0. So I'm pitching to counter that fact. Right now it's the craft is kind of wobbling. There we go. And so now we're in the positive, so that means we will be hovering 1 second before we hit the ground. It's a strange calculation, but effectively I'm kind of managing that towards 0. And we are wobbling a bit. So let's see, because I do have, let's turn on RCS. Let's stop using that. I'd like the orientation of this craft to be different. Now in like, let's say reality, where the crew matters for this, I'd want to have designed this so that the windows were pointed down. So I only have a minute to kind of do, oh no. I only have a minute to do everything, so I'm not going to be able to do everything ideally. So I'm just going to kind of handle it as I was. Ideally, the windows would be pointed down so that they could actually see the ground that they are approaching. So that would probably give them their best shot of like actually visually seeing the information that is useful to them. So the engine we're using here is the lunar descent engine. That's what it was. That's what it actually was on the lunar module, and that is a good name for it because that is exactly how we're using it here. And its actual design was to be throttleable. So when I throttle the engine down here, you can see the thrust changing, which is very important for landing because to slow down for a happy landing, we need to be able to have a high thrust-weight ratio relative to the ground. But just before landing, you want to be able to reduce your thrust so you kind of can, kind of lower yourself gently to the ground, rather than kind of timing everything so that with a very high thrust weight ratio you get to the ground with zero velocity, so you'd be kind of approaching it at an alarming speed and just slowing down just to that final moment. So being able to throttle your engine is how you kind of control that. So let's see, right now I have it at high throttle, so this number is increasing. So one way for me to change that is to change this pitch so that it's closer to being directly opposite our direction of travel, and another way is to throttle the engine. So now I'm going to align these perfectly because that is how I want it to be pointed when we actually land. And now I'm going to throttle down. I think that's our shadow there. Our true height is 300 and some meters. So now I'm managing this throttle so that this time approaches 0. And I'm just kind of zooming out enough, so sorry. There we go. So that's the shadow of our vehicle. I need to throttle up a bit. I mean, hovering would be okay. So pretty shortly here, there we go. So now I'm going to tell it to point up. So I cut the engine. I probably shouldn't have cut it, but I mean, that's pretty much always what I do. Just cause. Really, realistically, you'd throttle down and then cut out. Yeah, so that is a successful landing. And we had plenty of Delta V left over. Again, this is kind of a pretty light version of this craft. Probably lighter than it could have been historically built, but well, within a range of sanity. And so Schaub's designed it in a beautiful manner, and it functions, and I thank him for it. So extend the ladders. So this is actually, so if, again, I've probably mentioned it before, but if you, I highly suggest you look at a picture of the Gemini craft. So these are windows that look out in front of the two passengers, and these are hatch doors that open up like that. And so the crew would, put on their spacesuits, depressurize the crew cabin, then open two independent doors here, and then step out these ladders. That is how they would have actually come down to the surface, and that's how you get. This is an alternate way to get two people to the surface of the moon. Alternate to the Apollo lunar module system. Yep. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm glad that landed. It controlled very nicely, so I'll stop swinging around. So now you can see where I landed. Vaguely in the flat, lava-covered areas of the moon, which are probably the safest place to land, even if they're not necessarily the most interesting. Like, part of the reason NASA spent so much money to go to the moon and ended up training their astronauts in science and eventually sending a geologist was to learn as much about the moon as you can. With actual humans there. And so they selected their landing locations. You can look at every time they landed, people on the moon, they landed in a different place and did a whole bunch of different science experiments that were unique to the location they landed at. Just super neat. All right, so we have landed here. So I don't have any people to get out, but I've kind of explained how they would go about getting out. And now it's a little tricky. I think there is one glitch in this craft design. So I'm going to do probably what they wouldn't have done if you've looked at the way the actual lunar module functioned. There was the descent stage, the big kind of square-based part with the 4 legs that landed on the moon, and that had the tanks for landing on the moon and for their wastewater and various things. And that stage was left behind when they launched off of the moon. And so what I would ideally do with this would be to separate basically leave behind this first stage just on the moon and kind of use this as a launch platform for this next stage to ignite and head off. But from my test, I believe, and Shabs, I think, mentioned it, having some trouble with it as well. Basically, there's some clipping that causes it to not behave ideally. So I'm just going to do a quick save, and I'm going to try to do it that ideal way just so you can kind of see what I mean. Shut down. So that terminal landing engine is off. Shut down. So all those engines are off. And so now thrusting up. So this will separate the first stage, and okay. So that wasn't too bad. It's definitely having trouble. Definitely having trouble. See, it kind of caught on that first, on that landed stage. Oh yeah, yup. It caught on that landing stage, and it took too long to correct for its own good. So ideally, that would be a very important part of the design of this craft. They would design it so that nice, safely and cleanly that terminal landing stage would be able to separate from the ascent stage without kind of causing that bit of a flip as I had there. So I'm just loading to my quick load, and I'm just going to take off using that descent stage so that I'm kind of a bit above the surface when I switch to the ascent engine, which will give us adequate time to separate. Yeah, you can see, so that was kind of a glitch of this craft design, but hey, it still works really, really nicely. All right, so we're going to ascend, and it gets a little bit of wobble, and that might be because the ladders are here, if I think about it. Maybe if I put two ladders on the other side, it just might be a simple mass asymmetry of the craft for all I know. But all right, so we have done that. We have risen from the surface to some extent. Now let us just shut that down, dump that stage, and there we go, we're heading up, see? And that stage will head back down. All right, and we will head 90-degree direction and approach, go into orbit of the moon again. And so this is the way that I intend to send 2 astronauts to the surface of the moon with Gemini Direct. So this is probably pitched over too far. Time to apo, I kind of want that to keep steady or climbing or something. All right. So as we head away, let's see if I can kind of angle it so that the crew can look down, which apparently is like so. So as we start pitching over, I probably shouldn't pitch over so, all right, I still have that issue. Let's pitch up just a bit from the surface prograde, because I want to keep an eye on this time, because I want the the apoapsis to be in our future. More in our future than 30 seconds. That kind of accounts and correlates to our altitude. So that must have been a relatively high location that we landed in, because all these numbers are saying 11 kilometers, but the true altitude above the surface is 4 kilometers. So that must have been higher than the average location on the moon, or maybe that altitude is from the lowest location. I'm not sure. I think it might vary by body. I don't recall exactly what we chose within RSS as the standard. I paid attention to it for the gas giants, but not for these solid bodies, what zero altitude actually accounts to. So yeah, so if the windows or mirrors or cameras were set up nicely, the crew could actually be looking down at the surface. The cameras in RCS the RCS is kind of causing it to wobble a little bit. Oh man, time to apo is still going like that. Okay, let's go 35. Yeah, so kind of one of the interesting things, maybe this is what I find a little confusing or difficult to believe. I'm not sure, but that just this tank has enough fuel to get into orbit of the moon, to send this craft back towards the Earth, as well as to have all the life support hardware and supplies. Like maybe the fuel these individual fuel cells which Shop set up, or maybe they're a little lighter than they should be. I'll have to look. Or maybe just the mass of this tank is lighter. Something just feels a little wrong with me, that with right now, like over the surface of the moon with like under 10 tons, we're able to get into lunar orbit. We're going to be able to send ourselves back safely towards the Earth and keep the crew alive for the the requisite 3 to 7 days as we go back towards the Earth. But regardless, it's a brilliant, beautiful design. Just like I'm just plus or minus confused about the masses. I think they should be just a little higher to be slightly more realistic, but nonetheless, all the staging and design is is beautiful. Yeah, some kind of antenna would be needed on these stages so that this craft could still communicate with Earth. Like you could have an antenna on that, say, on the descent stage or on the crasher stage or something like that. But ultimately, those stages get left behind, like obviously. And so you'd need an antenna either on this stage or an antenna up here, like this is, which is able to communicate with Earth, or with, say, like if you placed if maybe they could place a purpose-built satellite in orbit of the moon before the crewed mission to the moon, so that it acts as a relay. So you need a less powerful antenna on this craft, so it can communicate with a satellite or a set of satellites in orbit of the moon to relay communication back and forth with the Earth. All right, so time to APO is getting pretty high now, which is fine, which is good. So we're just allowing it to pitch down a bit. This engine is a little weirdly controlled. I see it kind of wobbling up and down, even though as it's slowly approaching. I think the reaction speed it has is just a little off. I've never used this engine before. I think it's a European engine, the Asterisk. It's rather than shops use this one rather than the lunar Ascent engine, which I don't know if that one is a bit stronger or a bit weaker than this one. I don't know. I think this one just has some kind of slightly odd configuration because it kind of wobbles its way while it approaches whatever order you give it. So we are slowly but surely approaching lunar orbit. Pretty low thrust on that engine, just 1/3 of a G even at this point. So let's just time accelerate. Time to AP is still declining, which is kind of what's desired. Just as with, say, reaching orbit of the Earth, you want to, here, let me go to surface prograde 0. You want to kind of level out at some acceptable altitude. So here, because there's no atmosphere for the moon, our current altitude would be just fine. So once we actually approach this, once time to APO approaches 0, then I'll just kind of tweak my pitch so that I can go into orbit. So you've still got a bit of a ways in terms of delta V. So because the moon is so much smaller and lighter than the Earth, it takes a lot less delta V to go from the surface to orbit of the moon. It takes less delta V to go from the orbit of the moon to leave the orbit of the moon and head back towards Earth. But if you trace the math backwards, like all the fuel that you had to use to get here had to go through those more challenging delta V transitions. You had to go through they had to be payload in the 9,500 or so meters per second to get into Earth orbit, and then they had to be payload for the 3,100 or so meters per second to head towards the moon. They had to be payload to be placed into orbit of the moon. And so while they're smaller delta V numbers, they're expensive to buy. You have to launch a lot of mass from the surface of the Earth and then send them from orbit of the Earth out to the moon, for them to even have a chance to do their job here. So while the numbers appear less impressive, yeah, it's quite the mission. And now the crew is looking down still. Yep, nice. So they get to look down. So yeah, just basically the one thing that is most challenging, that was never a solved problem for doing something like Gemini Direct, was how do they actually have the feedback necessary to be able to land on the moon? Because the Apollo LEM pilots were able to look through windows. All right, so now here we are in orbit. Still kind of thinking whether I'll make this a longer video or not. I think not. I think I'll cut it pretty soon. We're at about 30 minutes. So the last bits remain to do a burn to leave orbit of the moon and head back towards the Earth, and then to deal with the high-speed return through Earth's atmosphere to land. But so far, that was pretty successful. So thanks for watching. This has been RP-0 America. We have brought the Gemini Direct craft, from the down to the surface of the moon and back into orbit of the moon. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.